I would like to start by reading the Suquamish land acknowledgement. Typically when we are in the auditorium, we start with a land acknowledgement. And even though we're dispersed, I want to make mention of the fact that to acknowledge that BIMA is on land that is within the Aboriginal territory of the Suquamish people of the clear salt water, or Suquamish people. Expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers, the Suquamish live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquamish live and protect the lands and waters of their ancestors for future generations as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. With that, I'd like to give a little introduction to our speaker tonight. We have Anna Teiche, who is featured in a solo exhibition at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art. Anna has roots on Bainbridge Island and is currently quarantined here on the island. She attended Bainbridge High School and went on to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where she graduated in 2018. Anna went on to wide travels first to Iceland, then to Lithuania, and then to Budapest, and finally ending up at the Rockland residency in Bremerton, outside of Bremerton. These residencies really make the foundation for what Anna's going to talk about tonight. But I was struck today thinking about her work and in light of the way that we are presenting this talk, and how the crux of her work is really about bodies and about this kind of mystery and intertwining and communicating, and this sexiness, really. And here we are, two talking heads. So the irony is not lost, but it really does provide a kind of a fertile ground for talking about her work tonight. The exciting news, I don't want to ruin it, but if you saw the trailer for this talk, you will know that Anna has been accepted to University of Texas at Austin for graduate work, and so will not be here for too much longer, as on to more adventures. And so we're very fortunate to have her here. I'm particularly delighted because of the way that we met was through shared interest in artist residencies, and that was just a scant year ago. So the fact that she is featured in a solo show is also very notable. I'm going to step out of the way and give the camera and mic over to Anna, and we'll revisit conversation afterward. Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristin, for that introduction. Just gonna get my slideshow set up. Let's see. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight. This is so exciting to get this going, even though it is virtual, so it's a little strange for me, definitely. Let's see. Okay, sorry, having some technical difficulties getting my screen going. Okay. Okay, so I just want to kind of preface this talk by saying that as I've been thinking about this and setting up this slideshow for the past couple days, I've really been thinking about ideas of home. I've been lucky enough to spend most of 2019 traveling through artist residencies all across Europe, and it really shifted how I was thinking about what my home was, who my home was, and with kind of in light of COVID-19, it's certainly kind of drawn me back to my roots on Bainbridge and in the Seattle area. And so that's what this talk is really going to focus on, this kind of thinking I've been doing on this topic. So to begin, let's see. I really began this kind of painting series that I've been working on at Cal Poly down in San Luis Obispo, California, where I graduated in 2018. And when I was at Cal Poly, I became really interested in blues dancing and the blues community overall. I became friends with a lot of the people there and really became interested in how radical of a community this was. Blues dance originated out of the slave trade of the US and was danced by African Americans originally. When it was then revived many centuries and decades later, it's danced mainly by white people. And I became really interested as I was doing this dance style and talking to people in the community about how we were grappling with kind of the identity politics broadly found in the US and specifically found in this community of people, I think arguably in some ways appropriating, but also appreciating a style that was not kind of their own by heritage. So this photo is of kind of the dance scene that I came from, that I learned to dance while at Cal Poly. I personally became really connected teaching the style of dance, playing music for people to dance to. And what it led to for me was one of the first paintings called Partners. And I realized as I was at Cal Poly that I had this just long-lasting love and fascination with texture and pattern and color, and I wanted to bring that into my painting practice. So this was done in 2018, and I wanted to then somehow kind of envelop the community that I found in dance without painting dancers per se, doing dance and dance styling. So with this painting, I ended up working with some really close friends of mine, and I had them sit for me, and I wanted to explore the power dynamic in their relationship. So these three individuals were in a polyamorous relationship, which was quite common in the blues scene of that area. And I became really interested in exploring how both pattern and textile could relate to our individual selves and how it could then kind of translate to this feeling of the power dynamic between this relationship. So to kind of talk about the background of how I create paintings and what goes into making a painting like this, I first began painting this particular painting by having the three people sit for me just in their home. I surrounded them with patterns and kind of blankets and things I found around their house, and then had them sit however they wanted. So I wanted them to feel really comfortable in the space and just to settle in so I could watch kind of how their body language would change and then document that. So in this particular work, I spent about 2 hours with the sitters, and as I kind of was photographing them, I started asking them questions just about their relationship, about what it was like to be in this particular relationship and how they felt about it, kind of as it continued throughout their college life. And I think what became really poetic to me and also just really interesting was that I noticed the two men were wearing kind of opposite patterned clothing, where their pants are kind of contrasting colors and their shirts are inverse polka dot patterns of each other. And it felt like in some way this mirrored their personalities, which were really quite opposite. And it became pretty apparent as I was talking to them that they didn't really like each other, but that they were brought together by their love of the same woman. And I thought this became really a beautiful way of looking at this relationship, where the woman, I think, visually and formally acts as this bridge between two men that, were only there together for her sake, and because they both loved her and would do that to be with her. So then moving on, I kind of continued my interest in this, but I wanted to explore other types of relationships that I found while in this community. So these were two other close friends at the time, and these two paintings became kind of a collection of sorts for me, where I began photographing them similar to the last ones, and I spent probably 3 hours with them working between photographing them and just talking with them. But something I really love about this painting in particular is that it actually developed when I was in the kind of senior painting studio alone, and one of the professors came in and had this massive box of old fabrics from, I think, the 1970s. And, you know, he was like, you know, just let like everyone else know who's in this studio that I have all these old fabrics. I don't want any more. Feel free to like, you know, use them if you need them. So then he left and I was alone. So I just grabbed the whole box and I was like, I am so in love with these fabrics. I know what I need to do with them. So I just kind of like stole them from the rest of the painting crew and went to do this photo shoot where I wrapped them in all these fabrics I'd found. And what I found while working with these two friends was that at the beginning, the photo shoot, it felt kind of stiff, but it also, the way they were sitting on the left here in couple one, really felt like a Madonna and Child sort of pose from like a Renaissance era painting. And I became really fascinated by the art historical references that I could make in this kind of painting while still modernizing it and kind of bringing it into my own exploration of a relationship. So then on the right, this photo and the photos that kind of went into making this painting happened kind of farther into the photo shoot. It was getting really playful. It was just, we were just like friends hanging out and I happened to be photographing them while we did that. And what it led to was this painting that felt like I needed to add some more chaos into it to represent sort of just the like the movement and the dynamism of this kind of relationship that was happening. So I allowed the patterns to kind of migrate off of their native fabrics and to tangle with the bodies and the figures found there. So these paintings were actually in my BFA show at Cal Poly. And after this, I graduated. I spent, you know, the summer in California and then moved back home to Washington. So this is a photo of my studio at my parents' house and their dog, Rosie. I gained my studio assistant, the dog. She's very snarky. And I spent the winter at Bainbridge painting and trying to figure out kind of how to be a painter outside of an academic setting. So I noticed when I got home, you know, I kind of had lost my physical community of artists that mainly were based in California. I didn't know a lot of people kind of in the area anymore. So I started reaching out to people from, you know, my childhood, from high school that I'd known to kind of just see where they had gone, what had become of them in the 4 years of college. And I began with this painting of a really close friend from high school named Tyler. And it had turned out kind of through Instagram, I found him, and it turned out he'd become really interested and involved in the drag community at his own college. So this painting for me it shifted, I suppose, my painting practice from an exploration of, you know, relationships and identities found in that to an internal look at the relationship to oneself. So I found this painting really fascinating because I was really able to work with Tyler to bring in different fabrics and elements from his life, from, you know, his childhood to his interest in the zodiac and his heritage in Puerto Rico, and to relate all these things together in one portrait. So I became fascinated by how this was a look at, you know, his relationship between his drag persona, Honeybee Sapphire, and, you know, his personality just as a person in the world. And it became just really exciting to me to look at our own individual identities and to shift my focus from couples and from relationships to that. So next, I really wanted to kind of take advantage of those who were around me and my kind of current community on Bainbridge in the area. So I actually painted my grandma. I think she's listening now, so hello, Granny. But what was really exciting about this is that it had such a personal link to me, and that going there and going and working with my grandmother, I was able to learn so much about my own family history. She's really involved in researching genealogy and our roots, especially in Norway and England. And with this painting, I went over and I was like, okay, I'd really like to photograph you to then paint you later. And we talked it through and she was very willing and excited. And then she took me upstairs to this closet that I honestly never knew existed. And she just pulls out just like box after box of these beautiful old textiles from like all sorts of, you know, her life experiences, where, you know, some of the things that really excited me were, for example, on the right, you know, there's a little pillow with like a hint of a face peeking out, one of the only faces I've ever really painted. And that pillow turned out was, I believe, made in the 1920s, and it was her mother's. And it just felt like this really beautiful symbol and link to my grandmother's heritage and to my own family line. The kind of big, here I'll show you my cursor, this big crocheted blanket right down the middle is, was, I believe, made by her grandmother and then passed down, you know, through decades and generations to my grandmother. And it just felt like each fabric here, you know, we picked together to be a symbol of some element of her life. And for me, this painting really cemented in me my interests and ideas about how we relate to fabrics in our lives. How when we're born, you know, we're kind of instantly born into a textile and, you know, wrapped in blankets and clothing. And that this doesn't stop, you know, as we grow, we're always kind of collecting these textiles and then, you know, passing them on or keeping them as kind of cherished objects and pieces of art in their own right. So as I'm making these paintings, I was applying to artist residencies, and I'd found out I got into one finally. And it was based in Northern Iceland, called Ness Residency. So I decided when I was gonna do these residencies, I wanted to bring as little as possible. So I didn't even bring oil paints. I brought gouache paint and a bunch of like embroidery supplies and just raw unprimed canvas. So this is a photo of pretty much everything I brought with me. And then I shipped a box of kind of extra supplies as well. But so I arrived at the end of February in Iceland. It's a small town called Skagastrand. There's only about 800 people in the town, I believe. Its main kind of source of income is fishing and farming. And so I took this photo the day I arrived, and I was having a bit of like a, oh my God, what have I done moment. I was like pretty much wearing all the clothing I had brought and still just so unbelievably cold, and it's so windy and snowing, and there was sunlight for about 4 to 5 hours a day at that point. And I'm just kind of like, what am I gonna do in this village, you know, that's so isolated and right on the north coast up a fjord, like, you know, so far from, it felt like any civilization. I was a little terrified, but also very excited by this opportunity. And what I was immediately struck by was just the shifting and constant changing of the weather and of the landscape there. So on the left, you know, one day I woke up and went walking about the mile it took to get to the painting studio. I noticed that the whole shoreline was frozen with these kind of discs of ice floating in it. Other days I'd wake up to not be able to see anything out my window because it was snowing and so windy, it was blizzards. Some days it would just be clear, beautiful skies. And some nights I'd be lucky enough to be walking home and to see the northern lights out kind of dancing in the sky. And it's honestly, it was so impossible to get good photos of the northern lights, but one of the most phenomenal experiences I had. And what my interest in the weather and just the kind of liveliness of the light there led to was kind of a different way I looked at playing with light in my painting. So this painting I created of a fellow artist at that residency named Holly. She was a Canadian Chinese woman who was about my age and really grappling with similar ideas about identity, but in her own life. So she was really exploring just this struggle between feeling like, you know, her heritage as a Chinese woman mixed with, you know, her mother's heritage and her culture as a Canadian was seen as very black and white by those around her. And she was doing these beautiful photographs about this while she was in Iceland. So with this painting, I think formally, I was so taken by the window blinds in her bedroom and just the way they created this pattern that kind of mirrored her bed sheets and her clothing, that I just had so much fun, honestly, trying to translate this idea into a way of manipulating patterns through light. I think then on a more kind of conceptual level, I became really interested in how this black and white way of the lighting being so stark in her bedroom could mirror her own kind of struggles with identity, struggles with feeling kind of stuck in this box of feeling like she didn't quite know where she belonged in her own culture. So after I kind of got over the initial just like fascination and obsession with being outside in Iceland and taking in all the nature and the hiking there, I really fell in love with the textiles I found, which was sort of the original reason I chose Iceland as a place to travel to. So this, I'm sorry this photo is really pretty poor quality. I think it's actually a photo taken of a screen, but it's just so like wonderful and meaningful to me. I had to show it. And it's a few of the artists there, and we're all wearing sweaters that were knitted by locals in the community. I think kind of rural Icelandic culture feels to me like very cozy in a way. A lot of the women still carry on really traditional ways of spinning yarn and knitting it through these very kind of specific Icelandic sheep. And it became just a really exciting way for me to explore patterning and traditional cultural values that I found while in Iceland. Other textiles I found were a little weirder, kind of funny. So I did notice as I was there, there was a lot of embroidery and different textile art methods that were kind of prominently displayed in people's homes. But like they were really odd to me. They were funny, they were a little creepy. And I just fell in love with like documenting these and taking photos constantly of these strange images I found all over the town and over the country as I traveled. And it felt really earnest how I saw these, where they were displayed really proudly by locals as a way, I think, of tying to the lore of Iceland, which is really a powerful storytelling history there. So here's some other examples. On the left, this was actually in a home of a local who ended up like towing a car for me. It was quite nice. Kind of them, because I was kind of stranded. And it really, I couldn't believe they had this like weird print of a painting of trolls that like I thought was honestly really ugly, but also was so funny. It just brought me a lot of joy. The same with the church on the right here, the patterning of the carpet just really fascinated me. It felt like this kind of vintage Icelandic strange fusion sort of painting patterning that I just became really obsessed with. So here's an image of my studio as it was in Iceland. It was just a little area in a larger old fish factory, and there were about 10 artists all working in that space. And what I really became interested in was just painting small images every day as a way of documenting my time there. So on the back of each of these paintings, I would actually write about what I did that day or what I was thinking about. And then kind of just as a way of keeping almost a journal of my time spent there, because artist residencies felt so foreign to me. I didn't quite know what I was doing or what I was supposed to be doing with my time. And so what I realized in just making so many small paintings, where I would usually make, one painting that would take me months, is I just began making paintings of things around me. And often that ended up being paintings of my feet. I honestly don't totally know why I decided to paint my feet. It felt though like a way of grounding me and kind of acknowledging that I was present, that I was in these different spaces that were so foreign to me, but that also really began to feel like home. In some of them, I would even embroider onto the paper, such as the one on the left here. I embroidered the little like hairs onto this piece of paper over my painting. And it just really felt like, as I continued traveling, because I was in Iceland for about 2 months, I felt like my shoes kind of became my home, because I felt so nomadic going, between countries, between cities and towns there. It felt like my boots were like the closest to home I had in my backpack. So in painting my feet, it was this way of like acknowledging where I was and, that I was always moving. I also began working with photographing other artists, such as with Holly earlier, and this one with another Australian woman that I was living with at the time. And what this painting and embroidery really became for me was a way to get to know the locals in the area. So there was this, I found out about halfway through my stay that there was this kind of knitting circle that would happen once a week at this bar in the town. And the bar was open for 2 hours every Saturday. And then the rest of the time it was closed as a coffee shop during part of the day. But, you know, once a week they would open specially at night and like serve everyone a glass of wine, and all the women would go and sit and just knit and gossip. And so I started bringing this embroidery in particular there because it was so time consuming but so repetitive that I was able to go sit and just meet kind of the fiber artists and the women of this town in a way that felt really natural, and like I was able to join in their space and in their own practice as a community. So after that, right around the end of April, I booked a flight to go to Lithuania, which was the next residency I was accepted to. I decided to go straight there without returning to Washington first. And I really didn't know much about the town I was going to, called Kintai, or really the country as a whole. So I kind of just showed up with my backpack, just ready to, you know, see what happened. But this image is actually of an old schoolhouse from the 1930s in the town I was staying in, and the residency program had bought this schoolhouse to convert into a studio and a living space for artists. So I was living in it and also working in it at the time I arrived. All I knew about the town was that it was on the Baltic coast. So it was really actually only like 2 miles from this really famous European like resort destination. But I did not know much about it. But this was, if you walked about 20 minutes from my studio, this is where you'd end up, right on the beach. It was just so beautiful. It was so green. I was kind of like shell-shocked by how many trees were there after being in Iceland in this kind of desolate, snowy landscape. So it was really exciting, I think, just to like be in nature in a place that felt a lot like Washington and, you know, my home here. So what I also found, though, as I kind of just walked through the town, was that nobody spoke English. The town had never had a census taken because it was so small and so remote. And there wasn't really any public transit to or from this area. So I was really dependent on the residency managers who actually lived in a city about 4 hours away. So it became really isolating. I didn't really have anyone to talk to but one other artist who was living there at the time at the residency. But the two of us would just go on these long walks every day, just talking and like kind of getting our social interaction for the day. It probably would honestly be a great place to do some like COVID isolation because there just really wasn't much going on. So, but this particular image I found on one of my walks, and it was all these old abandoned buildings. A lot of them were kind of falling down, windows were broken, you know, kind of stuff was scattered everywhere. And so I started doing some investigation to see what these were. And it actually turned out that they were an old kind of summer camp built in the Soviet era when the Soviets occupied Lithuania in the I believe 50s or 40s is when these buildings were built. So immediately I was just like absolutely fascinated with these. This is not what I expected when I knew I was going to Lithuania. And it just was so fascinating to walk through these buildings. I immediately started like trying to get inside whichever ones were open. And what I found was images like this on the walls of these, like, I think really meaningfully painted murals that feel like, you know, a little creepy, like the eyes are so big, but also like this image of what they wanted the community to feel, what they wanted children to see as like an ideal to represent the Soviet era community kind of building methods. I became really fascinated with what this was, and with looking at on a larger scale, how Lithuania was grappling with a divide in cultural influence from Russia and the US. I met a lot of people while I was in the capital city briefly who had really differing views on kind of politically who they sided with and socially who they thought would bring them a better life. And what I noticed in the community and in talking to the residency managers who actually had grown up in this town and whose parents lived there is that they said, you know, their parents lived in the town and were kind of employed by, you know, Soviet era jobs, and it became their way of life, and that when that ended and Lithuania became an independent country, they felt like they'd been abandoned. And, you know, this wasn't something I ever learned in history class growing up. You know, when we study like the Cold War, we certainly do not look at the angle where, you know, people felt like they'd been left behind by a culture and like their community had been removed and that they now had no real means. So it became really fascinating to me to look through this and to then also see all these relics of this past era and these past communities and homes that were kind of no longer inhabited. So in these images, there were old patterns found around these buildings that just absolutely fascinated me. I just loved seeing, you know, the fabrics hanging in the windows, these like strange tiles that felt kind of oddly narrative, but like I think formally kind of really strangely proportioned and painted. I just absolutely loved them. But while I was there, I was really struggling to get my visa extended. And it actually ended up, I had to keep traveling back and forth between the capital city to the migration office and this town. And they ended up denying my visa because the migration officer I was talking to just like didn't quite get what an artist residency was or like why that would be grounds for me to stay in the country. So I had to return to the US early, but while I was there for about the 3 weeks I spent in Lithuania before my visa expired, I started creating these small postcard-sized paintings and writing long letters and mailing them to friends and family, just seeking a connection with the outside world and with my own community because I did feel so isolated here, kind of away from any sort of arts community or just community of people I knew and loved. So this took me then back to Bainbridge for a while, where I actually pretty quickly got a job with the Blodell Reserve. Many of you who are local know this as kind of a nature reserve on Bainbridge. That's really just beautiful, full of trails and nature and, you know, beautiful gardens. And so I actually applied to this job as I was kind of in a hostel, like halfway headed home in the UK, just like, oh my gosh, like I need to get a job so I can afford to do more art residencies. But it really became such a meaningful experience to work here that it really shifted how I was thinking about art and my role as an artist. So as we see with this painting called Self-Portrait on the Lawn. So in this painting, I had just returned home. I felt like I needed to keep the momentum I'd had while I was traveling of working daily on painting, while also then juggling my job. And being surrounded, I think, constantly by greenery and nature and like this beautiful Washington summer, I just immediately felt like I needed to paint it and to involve that somehow in my work I was doing, kind of move my usual kind of indoor cozy fabric paintings to the outside world. And what this painting allowed me to do is explore my interest in patterning and texture in a more narrative sense, and also to move it out of simply painting fabrics and painting, you know, grass in a way that felt very textured and compare it to almost the textiles I was working with. I think this is something I really love about painting in general, is the way it allows me to create something that can look almost real, but that has this edge that feels imagined or narrative or just like a little off. And that's what I really had fun with in this painting. It also really allowed me to explore how my own identity was shifting. You know, I was there like before when I've been at Bainbridge, I didn't have a huge community of artists or people I felt like I could paint. And so I decided to just paint myself and to see what it would look like if I were to paint a self-portrait, which I hadn't done since, I started painting many years ago. And so what I ended up with was this kind of image that explored for me my own shifting identity between being an artist who was really academically focused, really focused on kind of this way I'd learned in college to be the right path to be an artist, specifically kind of a California, LA-based artist, which I was realizing was maybe not, where I wanted to live or what I really wanted to do. And so references this painting, there's a David Hockney book I'd bought at a LACMA exhibition the summer before of some of his portraits, and many of them were actually of kind of top blue chip gallery owners. And it felt like this way of me confronting that reality and confronting these textbooks I'd used that had been really highly influential and inspirational to me in my previous painting, and realizing that as I traveled and I met all these artists who, had such different paths to becoming artists that they were now, many of which, had never sought formal arts education, didn't feel that was necessary or even a good way to get into the art world. I realized it was such a massive, beautiful community globally, and that I could, find my own way in it, even if it wasn't, the traditional route. So after that painting, actually the day I finished it, I boarded a plane to Budapest, Hungary, and with this image, I still to this day do not know what Hippie Island is, but I found it while walking around one day when it snowed, and there's this kind of island in the middle of the river that flows through Budapest that's a big park. And Hippie Island was on the park. I never was able to see it open and to see like what it was actually used for, but it actually ended up representing a lot of what I found in Budapest, which I will explain later. So as I was planning to go to Budapest and beginning to arrive there, I really expected to be focused on working with patterns and art found in their really traditional, famous architecture, such as the Parliament building, which is pictured here, and textiles like this that felt, really historical, really ornate, and I think beautiful in their own way. But what I actually noticed as I was walking around the city is that these textiles only really appeared in really touristic and touristy settings, where they'd be, at like tourist-filled street markets and really touristy parts of the city, but they didn't really feel like they represented Hungarian culture as it was currently. They felt like they were only being sold to like appease the tourists who wanted something that was like authentically Hungarian feeling. And so as I spent more time of the 3 months I had there, I began to go to places in the city that were not frequented by tourists, such as this place. It was a flea market that happened once a week on Sundays. It took about 3 bus transfers and like 2 hours to get there. It was so far out of the main part of the city where I lived. But as I arrived there and was walking through, I just was so fascinated by this feeling of being the only non-Hungarian person in this crowd, and just like, nobody really spoke very much English. I was kind of bartering, just holding up like piles of cash, trying to see if I could pay them for different items. And I just was fascinated by just the sheer amount of stuff from all eras, from all items you could wish for, that I found in this place. And it felt to me like a possibly more authentic feeling of what Budapest became for me. Another thing I found walking through many parts of the city was that all over there were fabric stores. In numbers, I was really shocked by, because I just wasn't sure why so many people would need to buy fabric, just like every block. It was like almost like Starbucks in the US, where it's like every block there'd be another fabric store. And all of them had these really funny window displays that felt really dramatic and a little oddly sexualized, but that also had so much fabric draping and kind of color matching and color schemes that felt really familiar to me and my own painting style, that they felt like almost kind of sculptural embodiments of my paintings. So obviously I was just like immediately kind of obsessed with them and started taking photos of them and trying to figure out ways to explore textiles inspired by this and what I was finding in Hungary. Another thing I happened into that I really didn't expect to find was a museum show about the pattern and decoration movement, which took place in New York in the 1970s, but kind of in an art museum in Hungary, I just happened into this show. And this was a movement I wasn't really familiar with at the time, but it was kind of spearheaded by artists like Miriam Shapiro. And I just was so absolutely taken by this show. I spent hours in this exhibit just wandering, taking it in, and kind of looking at how these artists had played with patterning and a kind of turned their back on what was really the popular art styles of the day to explore decoration and pattern and color and kind of maximalist art in its own sense. So what this led to me doing was creating collages of photographs I would take of other artists there. So for the top left image here, I spent about 2 hours with a fellow artist at the residency who was from the Czech Republic. She'd brought her whole family, so her husband and her like 3-year-old son. And it was really interesting to spend time with her and to photograph her and just hear about her own lifestyle, being a mother and an artist, and just the chaos I think that was in her life and that we both had noticed was really in Budapest, where it was a city grappling with a really dark history from World War II and from Nazi Germany. But also that was such a resilient culture that they had risen out of this and created an independent culture, had kind of broken their ties with that, and were moving forward despite such tragedy. And so these paintings, these collages for me, I decided I wanted to create these forms that felt like they were almost human, but would never quite resolve into a full body. And I wanted to then tie in these patterns I was finding around the city, just taking in because I was so excited to find all these patterns everywhere. So this is one of the first paintings I did in this exploration called Malaika. And what this became was I was still painting on stretched canvas like I had done previously. And this is actually a woman also at the residency who was visiting from the UAE. And she felt, as we spoke, it turned out, she was a similar age to me. And she was feeling really similar kind of feelings of being, she wasn't quite sure where she was. She felt very in transit in her life, in her lifestyle, where she didn't have a place that she thought was really her home. She was living with her parents back in the UAE, but was doing artist residencies a lot like I was, as a way of kind of taking advantage of not having bills to pay or a home that had to be cared for. But she also felt like she was really caught up in this identity crisis of not quite knowing who she was or what she wanted to do. And so painting this way where her body became a collage of limbs that never quite fit together felt very natural, I think, as a way of representing her own struggles at the moment. In works that came after that painting, I decided to branch more into fiber arts, something I'd always really admired and loved, but never really kind of tried out very much. But I wanted to find a way to combine my interest in textiles and fibers with my interest in oil painting. So to do that, I began working with a local screen printer and copying wallpaper patterns I found in different buildings that were from the 1920s and 30s, I was told, and creating these textiles that were based off of that and kind of creating my own patterns out of these inspirations. What I was doing then simultaneously was making oil paintings, kind of as usual, but making them so that they were not rectangular. So I would stretch canvas on the wall, so I'd actually just nail it into the wall and then make my paintings of the collages I'd shown earlier. Then at the end, I would actually cut those shapes out of the rectangle so that they became these very fluid fabric paintings that weren't stretched any longer. And I was surprised, honestly, how exciting that was to work with canvas in a way that felt like a more kind of authentic fabric sort of feeling. In general, I never saw oil painting as a really textile-based craft until this time when I realized, that paintings in themselves that are made on canvas become a textile in their own right. And oil painting is a way of creating pattern on fabric that can then be used for other things. So in these paintings, in their ending result, what I would do is hang my screen printed tapestries with my oil paintings to juxtapose this feeling of the history of Hungary and of Budapest and my own observations with this tension, I think, that I noticed in their interest in becoming more westernized and more based in Western Europe and the US, with this, I think, pretty dark and kind of Central European culture that felt very distant from that as well, and felt like it was, they were trying to preserve it, but not quite sure of how to find this balance yet. So these paintings, beyond, I think, their biographical sense of being a portrait of this particular artist, the Czech woman, they also became this look at how I perceived Budapest and kind of the home I had made there for the time I spent. So in December of 2019, I returned to Bainbridge and really quickly packed my bags and went to Rockland residency. It's a fairly local one based near Bremerton and Belfair in Washington. I spent 2 weeks here, and I really, I was so kind of hurried between getting home from Budapest and then heading to this one. I didn't put much thought into it. I didn't really know what I was going to focus on, but I was like, I'll just arrive. It's a 45-minute drive from my house, so like, if anything goes wrong, I'm close to home anyway. And it had kind of that comfort there while I arrived. But what Rockland became actually was the first time I realized I had lived in Washington State outside of my kind of family's and like childhood home. So it became a way for me to really explore my local culture and my own kind of place within Washington and how I related to the environment here without my family being around as kind of a other lens. So this was my studio there. It was such a cozy, wonderful cabin, a very large cabin that I lived in with about 7 other artists. And we had, wonderful dinners and just like soul-inspiring conversations about art every night. And then I'd go and paint during the day. And it felt so idyllic, but also really surprisingly reminded me of Iceland in its remoteness and its really comfortable, cozy art community that it supported. So what I did while I was here is actually revisit photos I had taken in Iceland that I'd never been able to paint because I had planned to one day make them oil paintings, but it didn't have the supplies at the time. So for the 2 weeks I was there, I mainly worked on this painting called Amelia. It's of an Argentinian abstract painter I met at Ness residency that I spoke about earlier. And she really struck me just in her interest in travel and adventure. She was kind of self-started as an artist, didn't really ever go to art school or have any formal painting training, but made these just phenomenally intuitive abstract paintings that had such complex and wonderful color relationships that I felt like a real affinity with her work and with her as an artist. She really was an inspiration to how I began to view art making and the many different paths that we can take as artists in the art world. What I did kind of on my downtime after I finished this painting is I actually learned to weave. I never expected this would happen, but it turned out that the caretaker and artist who was kind of living on the grounds watching it actually had studied fiber arts and weaving in college. And we really bonded over our love of fabric, and she pulled out this loom and kind of taught me the basics of weaving. And it's just so exciting to allow me to be able to create textiles kind of from the ground up, literally, and just explore that art, that way of creating art and creating images out of textiles in a way that I'd made only paintings from in the past. It also turned out that actually she had just boxes of these old projects she'd made in school and textiles she'd made afterwards, and also that she'd worked as an industrial commercial fabric designer, and she had samples of all these. And so I just immediately, when I found that out, I was like, I need to paint you. Like, this just like has to happen. This is everything I've dreamt of in a painting. And so I did a photo shoot with her, and as a kind of insight to how I work with my photos, I think I took about 400 photos here. This is a selection of just a few of them from my camera roll. And I'd take photos of details. I'd have her change positions to get different angles and kind of areas of her limbs peeking out from the fabrics. These photos became such lush connections of texture and pattern that these beautiful hand weavings were able to capture in a way I think a lot of my older paintings didn't quite have, because of her own relationship with her art and with fabric was so unique to being an artist. It was just really exciting for me to be a part of that and to have a chance to paint her portrait in this way. So this is one image that I took just as a kind of, so you can see closer up what it looks like. And just each of these fabrics had such beautiful textural qualities and were mixed together so well because there were so many small sample pieces that it just becomes such a chaotic scene. It's so exciting and a little daunting to paint this. This is so currently the painting I'm working on kind of in quarantine is of some of the photos from this. And what I ended up doing was combining a few that had the right light quality and color qualities I wanted to then create one larger painting out of it, which is about 3 by 4 feet at the moment, but still in the very early stages. So with this, I just want to say thank you so much for listening, for joining in this virtual world we're living in. This image is one of my favorites, like the first image I showed, but I didn't quite know how to fit it in. But it's a poster I found in Hungary, and I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. And I think we do have time for some questions now, so we'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Hello. Okay.
Unmute. Okay. Thanks, Anna. That was lovely. We've had some live comments. People are really enjoying. They were so appreciative of what you shared about your work. We did have a couple of questions, and then I have a couple of questions. So I'll start with the ones that were asked online. Luke Austin has a question about what was your biggest aha moment in this body of work? Was there anything that suddenly clicked and changed the work?
Oh, I think honestly there were so many. As I spoke earlier about when I moved away from California and kind of stopped attending college because I graduated, I really was grappling with how to be an artist kind of outside of an academic setting, and how to make paintings that weren't part of a class or part of a formal critique all the time. And I think for me then, attending these residencies, one of the biggest aha moments was just seeing how many different routes there were to being an artist, in how all the artists I met, and allowing that to shape my work, I think, towards a more intuitive sense. So I really started as a very academic, research-based painter, but now I try to follow a lot of my intuition. Sometimes I can't even justify, why I choose to put that color there, or why I think that image is better than the other. But I try to follow that sense and trust it.
That actually is a great segue into a question that was asked by David Lasky about your seeming avoidance of faces. And I have questions or observations about that too, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I probably should have mentioned that in my talk, but it feels so natural to me now. I don't even think of it sometimes. But I actually, really early on, I stopped painting faces because I wanted these images to feel very abstracted while still, being based in realist painting. But I feel faces are such kind of windows to human emotion and to kind of an identity. It's immediately in an image, we look for eye contact. And I wanted to find a way to remove that, to remove kind of a wayfinding method when you view these paintings, so they become more of an exploration of what's going on that can slowly kind of develop into the realization that there are figures involved.
Thank you. Tricia Pearson has a lot of admiration for your work representing textiles, and also is really interested to know more about that connection. I think you did a great job of talking to that in your presentation. Is there anything else you want to share, just as something that the audience would like to know about your relationship, either to where you're going, where you've been? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as our relationship with textiles, I can't really even explain why I am so fascinated by them. But since I was a kid, I've always been drawn to patterning and color, and the way that textiles can kind of show all these things and combine them. Another, I think, formal interest of mine and in my art is actually my ties to formalism and modernist art, where patterns for me, I think, become kind of an exploration of modernist geometrical works with artists like Ellsworth Kelly and their reduction of like images into just shapes and geometry and color relationships. So with these paintings, it's my own way of reducing and kind of flattening the paintings into a single plane. So there's rarely much depth, I think, in my work, except for kind of quick moments of rendering and shadows. But it's my way of kind of looking at that, and the way that fabrics are a very historical example of this art movement.
Mm-hmm. I think that probably, hopefully, Patrick Callis also felt addressed in that answer, asking about drawing your attraction to textiles as a focal point in your art. Natalie Godfrey asks, do you ever feel trapped in your subject matter? One artist to another there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think on some level, sometimes I do feel like now I need to like always paint pattern, or that's like, what I'm known for, or how I almost identify myself as an artist, that I can't branch out from that. Like even now I feel like I need to dress in a lot of pattern, like it's so much a part of my own identity. But I also, it comes from like a deeper joy and satisfaction I get from the subject matter that I think I do see, and I imagine one day I will stop, painting textiles in the way I do now, or in the focus I do now. But they are, such a part of me that it still feels very homey, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have a question, actually. What I notice about your work is this deep connection to history, and also a really interesting timeliness of the work. A very present piece of it is this pairing of, I wrote inclusivity and transgression at the same time. And so that was more of a remark than a question, except I am interested in that idea of transgression, and of how you are revealing the figure, you're revealing selected, you're making a choice about what you reveal and what you conceal about figures. You're also helping us understand a little bit more, when we hear you talk about the work, what's the story behind it. And I'm curious to know if there's something that draws you into that tension or the pairing that you will be exploring in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I definitely became interested in this work through the history of portraiture, and kind of adding, I think a beautiful thing about painting is just how old of an art form it is. That even in the Western painting tradition, it goes back centuries, and that I can then, kind of add to this ongoing conversation with my own work. And in regards to portraiture in specifically, I'm really interested in the question of who gets to be painted and kind of who gets representation that ties into this wider idea of identity politics right now, and of, ideas about race and sexuality and intersecting identities and culture. And in making these paintings, I want them to be a way of almost repudiating the idea of a single identity, and instead creating these kind of chaotic images that for me feel kind of real and tied to my own views on identity, is constantly shifting and changing with every day.
Yeah, I think some of what you talk about as chaos actually becomes this kind of backbeat, or like a chorus behind the work that is like the antithesis of chaos. It's Ellen Ross Cardozo wants to say thanks. It was a fabulous presentation, and she wants to know what's next.
What's next? I actually am heading to UT Austin in the fall to pursue a master's in painting. So yeah, I guess we'll see how COVID affects that, but for the moment I'm hopeful. So.
We are so hopeful for you. I think it's lovely to see how your experience, both at home and outside of what your home of origin is, has impacted your development as a young artist. And I think I speak for definitely all of us at BIMA when I say that we're thrilled to see what happens next. And seems like you have wonderful chops and open mind and a lot of skills to bring to the table. So we're really excited for you.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone who tuned into this talk and who listened. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, you were wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. Yeah, we'll stay tuned for future opportunities to hear artist talks and other live presentations in the future. So thanks again. Okay, bye.
Everyone.